In today's topic, the first topic that we will try to understand is something like Spring JDBC. Okay, Spring JDBC is something like a very basic concept of how we can enhance the JDBC concepts that we are looking into right now, which means like the way we connect to the database and what happens when we try to retrieve the data and how we can map the data back to some objects. All these common functionalities that we are trying to do are again streamlined in Spring, and Spring defined a way of dealing with JDBC by giving us a template. Okay, a template, maybe you can consider it as a predefined structure or a predefined way where you can go ahead use it. Okay, so we will understand Spring JDBC template now, and once we understand Spring JDBC template, it's something like the way we deal with the JDBC concept. The next thing that we will do here is, once we create a Spring MVC project, we will integrate this JDBC into that project. Okay, so in this scenario, the first example that I would like to do here is like again interacting with the database, our own database, like the user table, and retrieving some records and all those things. So for that, let me first create a package. Easy one job. Spring JDBC template, and here is a class called user. In this user, let me create private ID, private string, username, private string, password. Three fields which are present in our table. So generate getters and setters. Format it. Control Shift F. Okay. And along with this, I will be using, or all I need is a simple constructor with all these three parameters. So what I will do is I will generate one more parameter, constructor using fields. Say okay, done. Formatting the code. Now all I have is a user.java class where the user.java class has three parameters: ID, username, and password. The next thing that I will do here is like create a user DAO class. Okay, so everyone knows that a DAO class is nothing but a class where I can write some logic which can talk to the database. Okay, DAO, data access objects. Okay, so I write here a class called user DAO, and in user DAO the first thing that I will use here is a specific template. Okay, I will add a variable, not a variable, a property here called Spring JDBC template. I will explain about this JDBC template in a while. Okay, so private JDBC template. Okay, there's the template which is given by Spring JDBC template. So that's one property that I wrote. Now the next thing that we will do here is, whenever the first and the foremost scenario, whenever I try to create an object for user DAO, I want the Spring container to inject an object into this JDBC template. So this is the concept. If you understand yesterday's concepts, all of yesterday's concepts revolve around the same thing. Like, hey, how you can create an object called student, and while creating an object called student, how you can inject an inner object like a book into that Means how can you tell the Spring container to do that? So this is the concept that we did, that we dealt with. So let's start understanding the basic concepts. Let me copy the Spring Beans.xml file into this package and delete the unnecessary stuff. Now, the next thing that I do here is like a class called demo. Now, in this class, the first thing that I will do here is like try to create an object for user DAO. So what I say here is uh, application context, app context equal to new class path XML application context. The next thing is like means this is a pose where which is common across all those slash easy learn Java slash Spring JDBC template slash Spring hyphen beans dot XML. Control Shift O, import the application context. Now see here, the next statement that I write is means everyone knows that I want to get an object for user DAO. So user DAO equal to, instead of saying new user DAO, I will say app context dot get bean of UDAO object, something I wrote. Okay, let me typecast it to user DAO. See here in the first concept in today's class, I till now there is only one line I wrote, like line number 7 in user DAO, which is like a JDBC template. Apart from this, I did not explain any of the JDBC concepts till now. Okay, I will start coding one by one, step by step, and I will explain all these things, like how I'm going to inject the values and how I'm going to talk to the database. Now, the first thing that we will be looking here is like how to configure Spring Beans.xml in this context. Okay, so I go to Spring Beans.xml. The first thing that I do here is I write a bean entry like the ID equal to UDAO object and the class equal to dot java dot spring jdbc template dot user DAO. Okay, yeah, I made a right configuration. Okay, now I created a bean. Well and good. Now the next scenario, I'm just trying to hook up some connectivity between all these things. When I say a user DAO which has a reference variable of type UDAO at line number 11, okay, when I say user DAO app context dot get user bean of UDAO object, my question is, will the Spring container create a user DAO object for me or not? Yes or no? Okay, someone said yes. What about others? This is the reason why I'm so much stressing upon like going back and practicing the Spring programs. Okay, so the answer is yes. Why? Because the Spring container can read the Spring Beans.xml file, and once it reads the Spring Beans.xml file, it identifies that UDAO object is nothing but a bean with an ID at line number 15. So it creates a user DAO object and it gives it to us. Now, my next question. When it creates a user DAO object, will it inject anything into this property called JDBC template? Yes or no? Yeah, this is excellent. Okay, the answer is no, it will not inject anything. Okay, now that's good. Now let me go ahead and write some code in the user DAO. As everyone knows that user DAO is something which will help us in talking to the database, right? So let me write a simple method. So I say public. I'm going to write a method find by user ID, which means I'm going to pass an ID. Okay, so if I pass an ID called 1, I want to get the specific user with that user ID. That is what I want to have. So now here the specific code that I say here is I'll get a user object equal to JDBC template dot query for object, and here I will write the SQL. What is the SQL that I want to write? Select star from user where user underscore ID is equal to question mark a dynamic value that I want to pass. And how can I pass the value? The way Spring says is new object. See, whatever code that I'm writing, it all might look very strange for you, but let me just explain. Okay, query for object, typecast it to user. The method query for object in the is not applicable for the argument. Spring object mapper. Oh, okay, okay. It expects a row mapper. Okay, got it. So let me just create one more class. I'll explain the scenario everything. One second. New class user mapper, which implements Control Shift O or the .spring framework.jdbc.o row mapper is what I implement, and I will implement the unimplemented method. Okay, I will come back and write the logic for this, and I will come back and explain all these scenarios. Just forget about it. And when I say new user mapper, and then I say return the user. Okay, so let's forget about what I wrote at line number 11 and line number 12. Okay, just forget about the logic that I have written, but all I want you to understand here is in the user DAO I wrote a method called find by user ID, which can take an ID from the user and go to the database and look for a user and fetch the user for you. Okay. Now, in this scenario, I'm talking to a database. Now, in our old scenario, how am I talking to the database? If I want to talk to the database, what I do? I go ahead and say that, hey, this specific database needs a connection where I need all the URL, the username, password, the driver class that I need to invoke. There are a lot of things that I need, right? So in that context, what we did, we created a properties file. We read it from using a resource bundle, created a connection object. From that connection object used a statement, and from that statement we try to fire or execute that statement and get the results and store it in the result set. All those things we did, right? Now see here what I am trying to do at line number 11 and at line number 11 is exactly the same thing which we did using the old JDBC concept. Okay, let me explain step by step. The first thing, I say UDO dot find by user ID and I say number 2. Okay. Now I'll ask some questions like be more interactive and answer them. You will understand the concept here. So let me execute this. The first question, will the user DAO object be created or not? Very good. User DAO object will be created. Well and good. Now, what did I write in the user DAO object? In the user DAO object, I wrote a method to call, or I wrote a method to fetch me a user. Okay. Now, my question. Can I go ahead and call the find by user ID method or not? Yes or no? Okay. Yes, very good. I can go ahead and call my find by user ID. So now see the user DAO. Yes, the user DAO object is created. Now I go ahead and call my find by user ID. Now when I say find by user ID, I am using a JDBC template which is present in line number 11, which I have created at line number 7. Now my next question to everyone. Did I initialize, or did the Spring container, either me or the Spring container, did any one of us initialize the JDBC template? Yes or no? Okay, we did not initialize. Now, at line number 11, will there be a null pointer exception or not? Okay, as simple as that. There will be a null pointer exception at line number 11 because of the JDBC template. So see here, the JDBC template that I am trying to use here is null. When I say null dot something, it will throw a null pointer exception for me. So leave rest of the logic like whatever I have written, but still when I say null dot, it will throw a null pointer exception for me. Okay. Now did you notice here it shows a null pointer exception in the user DAO at line number 11. So why a null pointer exception came? Why? Because even though the Spring container is creating an object for user DAO, it is not creating an object for JDBC template. When I say the Spring container is not creating, it means I am not doing anything, or I am not telling the Spring container to create an object. So if I tell the Spring container to create a JDBC template, then only it will create an object. Okay, if not, it will not create a JDBC template object. Now, my next question. To resolve the problem at line number 11, should I create JDBC template object or not? Yes or no? So the answer is yes, we need a JDBC template that needs to be created. Now, from here, I want you to understand very carefully. What is the use of JDBC template? The JDBC template helps us in connecting to the database. Okay, so the JDBC template knows to which database I want to connect to. So let us assume that I want to connect to Athena database, or I want to connect to some other database. I want to connect to MySQL. Like that, if I want to connect to any specific database, then the JDBC template knows that. Okay, or the JDBC template can help us in connecting to the database. Now my next question to everyone, if I need to connect to MySQL database, which is nothing but it has a schema which where we created like Athena. If I want the JDBC template to connect to that specific database, can the JDBC template automatically can it do that, or do I need to write some configurations so that Spring Container can inject it? Is it on its own, or should we write? Very good. We need to write some configurations in such a way that the Spring Container can inject the values into the JDBC template and can tell the template, hey, where to connect, right? So that is where I will write some configurations in the Spring Beans.xml file. Okay. In the Spring Beans.xml file, I will just make some configurations. Okay. Just a second. So now what we will do here is we will write some specific configurations that Spring has given. So let me do one thing. Let me just copy that from any of the old existing projects. Okay. Okay, I think for them I just directly told the concept. It's difficult to remember all those things. So let me just get it from. Not difficult, but I think I should not make any mistake in that. So okay. So see here. I wrote a specific bean. Okay, I guess the screen got stuck still. I'm in Spring Beans.xml file. It still shows a notepad. 1 second. I'm just waiting for it to come back to the Eclipse, the screen. Yeah, even I observe somehow, I don't know, like it's a little bit slow today, I guess. I'm surprised I saw the screen got stuck. Okay, but I'll try to just observe like how the screen is being shown and all. I'll try to go in a store phase. Now see here, in this context, I just try to add a specific data source which is given by the Apache. Okay, so this is a class, this is an already available class for you. So in this class, the basic data source class, there are four properties: driver class name, URL, username and password. Okay, so all those four properties I'm just trying to write the appropriate values. So when I say the driver class is nothing but com.mysql.jdbc.driver. If you notice or if you observe pretty carefully, all these properties or parameters we used to write in a dot properties file in the past, and now I just try to write all those properties in an XML file. This is the URL and this is the username and this is the password. So all these properties I am trying to write inside an XML file, and I am trying to give it to a class called basic data source class. Okay, this basic data source class is already available for you through the jars, so you are trying to use this one. Now the next thing that I would like to show here is, see here, in your project, okay, in your project there is a specific jar that we have added like commons dbcp. Okay, there is a specific class called commons dbcp. In that commons dbcp jar there is a class called basic data source. So into that basic data source class we are trying to add some specific properties. Okay, we are trying to add some properties called driver class name, URL, username and password. All these properties I've added. Now how many classes are there in this XML file? There are two classes. One is user DAO and the other one is basic data source. Now what is the next thing that I am trying to do here? The next thing that I am trying to do here is, when a user DAO object is being created, I want the Spring template, I want the Spring container to inject a JDBC template for me. Okay, I want to create an object of JDBC template. Okay, that's a good question. So we are using Spring JDBC template. The Spring JDBC template, okay, a quick question, means a quick answer to that is, we are internally using the Java database connectivity API only. Okay, so even if you go to different frameworks in future like Hibernate, okay, even if you try to understand the concept of Hibernate, you still use, means anytime you try to work with different frameworks which connect to database, at the end of the day they need to talk to the database using JDBC only, but everything else is an abstraction on top of that which will make our work easy. Okay, so we are using a JDBC template, and to this JDBC template, maybe this part takes a little bit of more understanding. That is the reason why I'm trying to re-explain again and again the same old concept. The first problem that we notice or that we saw is, when I created an object for user DAO at line number 11 in my demo.java, and when I try to call udao.find by user ID at line number 13, the basic problem was it is going to user DAO and calling the find by user ID, but when it comes to line number 11, since the JDBC template is null, the problem is the JDBC template null causes the entire functionality to break. Okay, so what are we trying to achieve here? The next functionality that we are trying to achieve is, we want the Spring container to inject a value into that, or we want the Spring container to create an object for JDBC template. So what kind of object that we want to connect, inject into JDBC template? Into JDBC template, we need to inject an object which can tell the template where to connect. Okay, so now if I come back to my beans.xml, I made some configurations from line number 15 to 20 which tells to which database it needs to connect and using what properties it needs to connect. That is what I've configured from line number 15 to 20. The second step that I will do here is I will try to inject these properties into the JDBC template so that the JDBC template will get all these properties and will understand that, hey, these are the properties that I must use and connect to a specific database which is configured here. That is what I will be doing. So now what is that I am trying to do? I am trying to inject. See here, I will be using a setter method injection in this concept. So what I do here is I will say a property. Okay. So for that, let me go to user DAO and create some specific property here. So how can we inject the data here? We can inject the data using a simple setter method, right? So let me write a simple setter method which can inject the data for me. So I say private void set inject db parameters, and the most important thing that you need to notice here is the type of input that I am passing here. The input that I pass here is nothing but a data source object. javax.sql.data source. Okay, now I say here this dot jdbc template equal to ds data source. So oh no, so not data. Yeah, I will explain the data source. One second. New JDBC template of data source. Okay. So if you see here, there is an interface called data source, and here you have something called as the basic data source, which implements the data source, which means the basic data source is implementing or getting the features from the data source interface. Now what I do is, see here, I am trying to inject using a setter method. So what is the setter method that it will I am trying to use? The setter method that I am trying to use is set inject db parameters. Okay, which is at line number 11. Set inject db parameters. So now what is the property that I need to write there? I need to write there a property called as inject db parameters with here. So I say inject db parameters, which will look for set inject db parameters, okay, in the spring beans.xml file. Now after this, what is the value that I want to inject? The value that I should say here as the id. So what is the reference that I need to take to inject? Okay, data source obj, or let me make some changes here. Okay, let me again explain step by step like what I'm trying to do here. The first step, okay, let me come to demo.java. In my demo.java at line number 10, okay, what am I trying to do? I am telling the spring container to say that, hey, go ahead and read spring beans.xml. That is what I told at line number 10, and at line number 11 I'm requesting the Spring container to give me an object which is having an ID UDAO obj. Okay, it goes to Spring Beans.xml and it tries to find that this is the ID that we are requesting for. So it tries to create an object for user DAO. Now, well and good, it tries to create an object. But while creating an object, what is the next thing that I am doing here at line number 23? I am trying to use a setter method injection. Okay, I am trying to use a setter method injection. So what is the setter method injection that I am trying to do here? I'm trying to call, or I'm trying to look for a setter method which is called as set inject db parameters. The name that I have highlighted here can be anything. Okay, it can be like inject db params, params. Okay, I made the changes here and I told inject db params. Okay, now it will look for a setter method in user DAO which is nothing but set inject db params. So now I go to my user DAO and make this as rams, set inject db params. That is what it looks for. So it says that, hey, I found a matching setter method. That is what it says at line number 23 in the Spring Beans.xml. Now, the next thing that you need to understand here is in the setter method of inject db parameters in my user DAO, what is the input argument that I am expecting? The input argument that I'm expecting is basic data source. Okay, so now if you see the highlighted part, the basic data source, it is exactly same as the basic data source that I have created at line number 15 in the Spring Beans.xml file. So what is this basic data source containing? The basic data source contains all the basic information that I need to connect to a specific database using the driver class, URL, username and password that I have configured. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to pass the basic data source information to the JDBC template given by Spring, so that the Spring JDBC template can understand to which database it needs to connect. So now in this setter method which I have declared at line number 23, I want to pass the one which I have created at line number 15. So how can I pass that? If I want to pass that object, all I use is, so instead of, see, if I say value, then it will pass only that value. Do you remember yesterday we were looking into some concept where when I am trying to inject, I wrote I name and value equal to, for line 1 I wrote 1 2 3 ABC street blah blah blah, something like this. So if I say value, it will directly pick up this one and will inject into the setter method. But in this context, I don't want to inject a hard-coded value. Rather, I want to inject a class, a basic data source class. So I should not use a property called value. Rather, I should use a property called ref, a reference which will refer to a bean. Okay, so whatever I write inside reference, the data source obj, it will look for an id, a bean with that id. So this is the one it finds. So what happens is it finds this setter method, and to that setter method it will pass the basic data source object as input. So now if I go back to my user DAO.java, what is that I'm trying to do here in user DAO.java? I'm trying to say set inject db parameters and I'm passing the basic data source object. So what is the basic data source object can do? The basic data source object can tell the Spring container, or not the Spring container, can tell the JDBC template where exactly it needs to connect. So it injects this .jdbc template equal to new JDBC template of this DS I'm trying to pass. so that the new JDBC template object that it creates, it knows to which database it needs to connect. So now I'm creating or I'm initializing the JDBC template object along with the user DAO. Now when I call user DAO.find by user ID, it will not show any problem for me. It will not throw a null pointer exception. So the same thing which I have explained till now, let me go ahead and debug it and explain you one last time. So at line number 10, I place the debug point. The next thing that I say here is, so, okay, let me explain this. Invalid property inject DB parameters of being class. Invalid has invalid settlement. Does the parameter type of match the return type of the capture? Okay. We go to user DAO. The problem should be I wrote the method as private. So in general, if I write the method as private, we cannot access it and we cannot set the values. So let me make it as public. Okay. Let me go back and execute the same old stuff. Debug it. And I do an F8. So see here, what happens in this context is, where is our control initially? The control is at line number 10. Okay. So when the control comes to line number 10 and when it tries to execute that one, first it goes and the Spring container is invoked and the Spring container goes ahead and creates or reads all these configurations. Okay. The Spring container reads all the configurations, user DAO, blah, 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 and it tries to inject the data source into the template. Now, that is the reason why it has called this method at line number 10, the setter method. And if you see the data source is nothing but the org.apache.commons dbcp basic data source that we want to inject into JDBC template. So now what exactly is the value of JDBC template? The JDBC template is null. Once line number 11 is executed, we will be injecting some values into it. Now if you see the JDBC template, it is not null. It has a data source called basic data source which tells to which database it needs to connect. So I can use the JDBC template now. The next step that I'll be doing here is I will come to line number 11. I will ask the Spring container to give me user DAO object and understand that once I ask the Spring container to give this object, the Spring container gives me a user DAO object along with a JDBC template which is already injected or which is already initialized. So now if I say F6 and go to user DAO, I'm not sure if you have noticed this in the previous scenario or not. In the previous scenario where when I did not inject the JDBC template value here, it shows here as null. But here, since it is injected, it is not being shown as null. Now it has some value associated with it. So now I can go ahead and execute line number 16. The line number 16 will cause an exception again because of something else, but it will not cause a null pointer exception for sure because of JDBC template. Why? Because the JDBC template has some values associated with it. So now I go ahead and execute it. Okay, did it return? One second. Let me go back to demo.java, execute this. See the user is null. See, it would be null. Why? Because of some reasons I did not write the entire code. That's the reason why it is null. But still we did not get a null pointer exception at line number 16 because of JDBC template. Okay, so that should be clear to everyone. So did you understand here that user DAO is being created and JDBC template is being injected? Now, what is the use of JDBC template? So from now onwards, you need not worry about the statement object, the prepared statement object, and all those things connecting and all. So once you do a configuration, the JDBC template is readily available for you to connect to a database where you can use that and talk to the database. Okay, it is more of like reducing the number of lines that you write and streamlining the process. Okay, so yeah, means line number 16 I'm yet to explain, but my question is, did you understand that I can inject a JDBC template by using a setter method, and I can use a JDBC template to connect to database? That is the point. If till that if you are clear, then I can go ahead to the next step. Is everyone clear till that point? Yeah, this is how we do it in real world also. Okay, so once again I'm one last time marking, is it clear to everyone till this point? Okay, that's good. Now we going to the next step. In the next step, what I am trying to do here is I will try to explain like what I have written everything else apart from this JDBC template. So now what did I say? Hey, I do have a JDBC template. See, from now onwards, I need not ask for connection object, call some other class, request for a connection object. I need not do all those things like how we did in regular JDBC. I just need a JDBC template object to connect to the database. Now, this JDBC template, once I get it, so all I do is I write a method. I use a method called query for object, and I write select star from user where user ID equal to some question mark, something that I want to dynamically pass. Now let us go back to our old JDBC project. So in our old JDBC project, if you see in the read operation, the first thing that I did here is, okay, if you notice here, the first thing that I did is I need to get a connection object. Okay, I need to get a connection object, then create a statement object, then say statement dot execute query. This is what I need to say, and once the results come, I need to store the results into a result set object, and I can iterate on that result set object and store all the values into user DTO one by one. Okay, did you notice here all the results are in this rs? Okay, rs, and then I said rs dot get int of user id, rs dot get string of username. Like this I need to write the code, and I need to insert the values into this user object. This is what we saw in our regular JDBC. The same old concept we will do in Spring JDBC also, in a little different way. Okay, so how it is different? Let's come back to the Spring JDBC. So the query for object, I say select star from user where user ID equal to question mark. That's okay. Now the way you pass dynamic inputs in Spring JDBC template is this way. You need to create an object array. Okay, and for every question mark you need to write something like id. So if I say user id equal to question mark and user underscore password equal to question mark, so in that scenario how I need to pass is for the first question mark id, and for the second question mark if there is some other string, then I need to pass pwd here. If there is one more question mark I need to say comma, and for the third parameter. Like this I need to keep on adding the dynamic parameters that I want to send in an object array. This is all a standard common syntax defined for taking dynamic inputs for a Spring JDBC. Okay, so if you see query for object, see here in the query for object, if you see here, it says the SQL and the object array, which is nothing but a sequence of inputs that we need for passing dynamic arguments to these question marks in the array in the SQL statement. Okay, so now I remove that, and I do have only one question mark, so I remove other dynamic values. So the second parameter is nothing but passing dynamic parameters that you need to pass in the form of an object array. Okay, and the last one is something which is important, called as user mapper. Okay, so what exactly this mapper class will do is, okay, if you go back to the read operation, if you go to the read operation, what did I do in the read operation from line number 32 to 34? From 32 to 34, I'm trying to get the results from a result set object, and I'm trying to place them in a user object. That is what I did, right? The same step will be done inside a user mapper. Okay, the same step will be done inside a user mapper in in Spring. Now let me go to Spring user DAO, and here I am passing a user mapper object. Means this is all a standard syntax team. So as and when you start using these concepts, you will understand these steps one by one. And if you see here, the user mapper that I have created, Spring says that the user mapper must implement a class called row mapper. Okay, and here I am passing user because this specific user mapper can only map user objects, which means I'm trying to restrict the input. Excuse me. Now, if I implement a row mapper here, I need to override a method. So row mapper is an interface. So there is a method called map row here, which I need to override. So now, if you understand the concept of row mapper, okay. So as I said, this is nothing but streamlining the process again. So again, I'm trying to go back to read operations that we did in the JDBC concept. Here we are trying to retrieve all the objects from the result set, and all I try to do is I try to inject some values into them, right? So what I do here is in the user mapper, see here, I'm writing some same old sequence of steps. Okay, if you want, like, I can copy the same code here, can copy the same code, and I can write here, and this is nothing but a user DTO. In our scenario, it's not a DTO. I did not write it as a DTO. I wrote it as user.java. Okay, so I say user equal to new user, control shift O. No, the constructor user is not defined. Okay, let me go to user.java and define a constructor. Okay, so now this is good. So I've created an object called user, and let me change this argument name to result set rs. Okay, rs. Now see, obviously the naming convention is different. It is not set UID, set ID only for us. So now what I do here is I'm just rewriting line number 17, 18 and 19 as per the current application. So I say, so RS is nothing but an object for us. So I say user dot set id, which is nothing but rs dot get int of user id, then user dot set username as this one, and I say user dot set password as rs dot get string of user password, and I'm saying return the user object. So what is that I'm doing? Instead of mapping it in the same class which we did in the JDBC program, I'm trying to remove those logic and do the same thing in here. Okay, now let me go back to user DAO and re-explain the three things. The first one is the query, the second one is the dynamic input arguments, and the third one is once you get an output, copy the object in copy the values which are coming from the database into an object. That is what is done by the highlighted user mapper object here. Okay, and all I do is return the user. Now let me go ahead and debug the program once again. So in the demo.java, I debug it. It injects the DAO for me. Then it calls the user DAO. Then it goes to line number 16 and tries to execute the query. And let me do one thing. Let me place a breakpoint at line number 13. Okay. So I place the breakpoint at line number 13. I come back to user DAO.java, and at line number 16, as soon as the query is executed, it calls the user mapper. Notice here when I say F6, did you notice it is calling the map row in the user mapper? So what is happening? It gets the result set. So now it gets what is the user object here. The user object is 0 null null. Now if I say use user dot set id, and when I'm setting the id, it sets the id as 2, and it sets the user name as Naveen, and when I try to run it, it sets the user password as top secret, which means we got all the three values, and I'm returning back the user object to the caller. Okay, so maybe one more thing that I can say here is I can, since I'm getting a user object as output, user usr equal to, I can do this, and this is out usr dot get username. Okay, once I run it, it fetches the username as Naveen. So if I try to say 1 and run it, it fetches the username as Raghu. Okay. So did you notice here in both the scenarios it is able to talk to the database, retrieve an appropriate record for us, and send those records to us, right? So this is like more of a streamlining process where the Spring template says that, hey, whenever you request for a DAO object, the DAO object internally has a JDBC template, where the JDBC template is created by the Spring container by injecting the data source into it, so that the JDBC template can understand to which database it needs to talk to and is readily available for you. So at line number 16, as and when you type in the JDBC template, it says that, hey, I know to which database you want me to connect to. So I can go ahead and connect to that database, and it finds this select query and goes ahead and tries to take the dynamic values from this new object and calls the user mapper for mapping the incoming JDBC records to a specific object called user and returning back that user object and assigning it to this user at line number 16, which is again returned back to the caller, which is nothing but demo.java at line number 13 to user USR, where I can say USR.get ID or name or password. So is this DAO concept clear to everyone? Like connecting to the database using JDBC template. Yeah, that's a good question, Adi. So my database server is always running in the backend, right? So whenever we installed, I hope everyone remembers that whenever we installed MySQL, the MySQL is installed as a service and it is running in your background as and when you start your laptop, the JDBC, the MySQL service starts running. So my JDBC template, I wrote configurations to talk to that server and a schema called Athena. I wrote those configurations in the XML file. And if you see the XML file, in the XML file I wrote that, hey, go ahead and use a MySQL driver and connect to this localhost 3306 Athena schema, and the username is root and the password is password. So make use of these data source properties and tell the Spring JDBC template to talk to this database and fetch me the results. Is that clear? Okay. The most important thing. Is that clear to everyone? Any doubts or any questions? Anything?